we see this as an opportunity to kind of commemorate their lives and their contributions. So we should be starting in about 3 minutes. For those of you who are joining us via the live feed, welcome. We're in the last panel for today. After this, we've got 2 sessions, one with Daniel Ellsberg and the other with Nancy Hollander. There's also, for those of you who are here, a campfire and a virtual world which you can visit Guantanamo and other things there, which are quite eye-opening. So you might want to just try that a little bit. And there's a campfire and maybe have a chat with some interesting people like Jeremy Hammond and Laurie Love, who I think were there earlier. So please do join us there. We are also, there was a problem this morning. There was a little bit of a glitch with the videos because we had not set I have not set permissions correctly. So I hope everybody's now had access to all the videos which are online, and more are getting updated as we speak. So we've had some amazing interviews, some very good contributions. And for example, from Ögmundur Jónasson, who was the former Interior Minister of Iceland and resisted America's attempts to go after WikiLeaks in Iceland. And so there's some really interesting bits of information in those. Iain, we might have to, I'll sit in the background and sort out the tech along with Moritz, but maybe you want to take over and
John Kiriakou should be here now as well.
Brilliant. We'll promote him to over.
He's promoted.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Iain, could you just run through the order of speakers for us?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm just going to introduce you because Deepa can't do everything, and it's a long day for her. So welcome, and I'll introduce you guys. And the idea basically is to, it's an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours. So that would be about 10 minutes each, maybe a bit longer, to talk about, hi John, to talk about your perspective on whistleblowing, investigative journalism and dissent, and then we'll have a Q&A. But what I was thinking of doing to maybe split it up a little bit was to have the 2 CIA whistleblowers first, if that's okay, and then maybe a short Q&A from the audience, if we can organize that after the first 2 speakers, and then move on to everyone else. So it'll be, because it's quite a long session. Does that sound okay? Sounds all right. Okay, so I welcome everybody to a very experienced and well, a brilliant panel of speakers on the subject of whistleblowing, dissent, democracy, freedom, and investigative journalism. And this is one of the final, I think the final session, panel session of the International Festival of Whistleblowing, Dissent and Accountability, which is the brainchild of Dr. Deepa Driver. And thanks very much to the speakers for attending. And the session will be first John Kiriakou and Jeffrey Sterling, 2 CIA whistleblowers, to discuss their perspective on whistleblowing and dissent. And would you mind having which of you would like to go first?
Oh, it truly makes no difference to me.
John, Jeffrey?
I'll defer to Mr. Kiriakou to go first.
Oh,
Great.
Okay, thanks. National security whistleblowing. There are some very serious problems in national security whistleblowing, as you might imagine. One of the questions that I'm asked most frequently is if I would do anything differently. The answer is almost no. The reason I say almost is because I would probably hire an attorney who specialized in whistleblower protection or whistleblower advocacy first before blowing the whistle. But in terms of the bigger picture, and when I say bigger picture, I mean what people really want to know is, would I do it again? The answer is absolutely yes. You have to understand the risk that you're taking, certainly. You have to understand that you're going to largely be on your own once you blow the whistle. But by God, somebody has to do it. One of the things that I think has to change, and it would require legislative action, of course, is that we must have a system where someone can blow the whistle and then present an affirmative defense in the event that they are arrested and charged with a crime. I've had this conversation with Ed Snowden a couple of times, that he's willing to come home. He's willing to go to court and to defend himself against criminal charges if he can offer an affirmative defense, even if that means conviction. He wants the freedom to be able to stand up in open court and explain to the American people why he did what he did, that it was for the public good. I wish to God I had had the same opportunity. I would have availed myself of it. But regardless of who's in the White House, I don't think any administration, I don't think any attorney general is going to want that to happen. In my case, my attorneys mentioned to the judge that we wanted to offer something of a modified affirmative defense, that there were things I was happy to stipulate to, but there was an explanation behind them. And the judge interrupted and said, Mr. Kiriakou, either you did it or you didn't do it, and you did it. And that effectively ended any defense that I may have been able to mount. People ask me all the time as well why I didn't go through the chain of command when I decided to blow the whistle. I went to the media. That's an easy one to answer. And that is that it was my chain of command that invented the CIA's torture program. Look, like any other American, I was able to read the papers and read what happened to Tom Drake at NSA. Tom went through the chain of command. Tom did his whistleblowing exactly the way we were trained and taught to blow the whistle. He went to his supervisor, then he went to the Inspector General, then he went to the General Counsel, all at NSA, then he went to the Pentagon Inspector General. They destroyed the evidence that Tom brought out, and then he went to the oversight committees. Everybody he spoke to was cleared for the information. And what did it get him? It got him 7 counts of espionage and 2 counts of theft of government property. So, if you're going to get punished anyway, you might as well go with the path that allows you the broadest dissemination of the information, if you think it's that important. For me, that was the media. I'm sorry to say that in the 9 years that have passed since I went on trial, in the 14 years that have passed since I blew the whistle on the CIA's torture program, literally nothing has changed. And there are other national security whistleblowers, more courageous than I, who knew what they were getting into, and who decided to do it anyway, because it was for the betterment of the American people. I'm sorry that they're being prosecuted right now as we speak. Thank you.
Yes, I can echo everything that John has said. And just looking at the aspect of whistleblowing, I mean, that is the accountability measure to keep an eye on power, to make sure power is not abused. So many, our government will tout the value of whistleblowers. Of course, not actions in question by the government, but maybe some other third party. When you throw the lens on government actions, the government really takes a stand and really tries to defend itself. And I think one thing I can talk about, John had this experience as well, is you're going up against the Espionage Act. Now, that is an almost impossible scenario, a situation to actually defend yourself, because you're not actually allowed to defend yourself when it comes to the Espionage Act. And we see throughout the world now that the actions against Julian Assange, they're using it to go after anyone that they don't like. It's being used as a retaliation measure. And my case was essentially retaliation from the very beginning. I sued the CIA when I was working there for discrimination. I was subsequently fired. I had issues about a operation I was involved in. I went through the channels I was supposed to. The CIA, though, was still angry at me for having the nerve to sue them for discrimination. And my discrimination case was thrown out of court, not because of merit, but it wasn't allowed to go forward because of concerns of national security. So that's a buzzword for whistleblowing, if you will, national security. That throws up the walls of protection around the government and allows it to do what it wants and what it can. I went through the proper channels to blow the whistle about a flawed operation involving Iran and nuclear weapons. And then subsequently, I was being charged with divulging that information to a reporter and charged with violating the Espionage Act. So even if you take the proper steps, take the proper measures, if in my case, the US government has a bone to pick with you, has a grudge against you, they're going to use whatever means necessary to go after you. And in this case, they're using the Espionage Act. And I think using the Espionage Act just shows how vital and how maybe the government has a bit of a fear of more people coming forward. So let's use the biggest hammer that we have, the Espionage Act, which will allow us to do what we want in court, prevent someone from actually defending themselves in court, and silent dissent. And I think whistleblowing continues to be important. It has to be important. All of these cases, John, myself, Snowden, they're all trying to use these as examples to say, don't do this, we're going to come after you. I think as more people stand up, that the strength of whistleblowing can change the situation and bring back accountability, especially when it comes to governments. And I think there's so much more work to do, and if we do it all in solidarity, change can happen.
Thanks very much, John and Jeffrey. John, could I just ask quickly, could you clarify what motivated you to blow the whistle in the first place?
It started for me in 2002, 5.5 years before I blew the whistle. I was one of 14 people at the CIA in the CIA's Counterterrorism Center who were approached and asked if we wanted to be, air quotes, trained in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. I had never heard the term before. And so I asked what it meant. And this senior officer who had approached me explained the techniques to me. I said, that sounds like a torture program. And he said, no, it's not torture. It's been approved by the Justice Department. It was approved by the president. I said, let me think about it for an hour. I consulted with another senior officer and I said, this is morally and ethically wrong and probably illegal. I went back downstairs and declined. I said, it's a torture program and I don't want any part of it. Years later, I was bragging to a friend of mine who is a former CIA officer and happens to be a retired brigadier general and a psychiatrist on top of it. We worked together in the Counterterrorism Center. And I said how well things were going for me in my career back in 2002. And he said, no, they weren't. And I said, yeah, they were. I was a star. And he said, don't you remember, after you declined the training, they started calling you the human rights guy. He said, that wasn't a compliment. They were mocking you. He said, your career began slowing at that point. Looking back in retrospect, he was right. I left the CIA in 2004, still waiting for somebody to come out and say something. Remember, I was seeing all this reporting coming back from the secret site saying there was a nurse in the room when Abu Zubaydah was being tortured and she fainted. There was a doctor who was vomiting from the stress after they tortured Abu Zubaydah. This wasn't what they signed up for. They wanted to come home. Well, when you curtail your assignment and come home, that's a career-ending decision. So I thought, well, certainly somebody is going to come out and say something about this torture program, and nobody did. I left the CIA in 2004. Finally, at the end of 2007, Brian Ross called me from ABC News and said he was going to do this report on the torture program. And I decided that I would give him an interview and that no matter what he asked me, I would tell the truth. And so I did. And I said three things. I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official U.S. government policy. It was not the result of a rogue CIA officer, as President Bush had told the media. And I said that the program had been personally approved by the president himself. And all hell broke loose from there. That's why I did it. I wish I could say to you with a straight face that, you know, I stood up and I told them this is wrong. It wasn't like that at all. I kept thinking, well, somebody else certainly is going to come out and say something, so I don't have to say anything. And I waited for 5.5 years and then finally said something.
Thanks very much, John. That's really a great story. Jeffrey, would you like to add a little bit more background to your own reasons for dissent and whistleblowing, please?
I guess for whistleblowing's sake, I was a whistleblower 2 times. I tried to blow the whistle about racial discrimination at the CIA. I was an officer, a clandestine case officer, and I wasn't allowed to have the same opportunities as everyone else because, as the CIA managers told me, I stuck out as a big black guy speaking Farsi. I did sue the CIA. The case was not allowed to go forward because it posed a threat to national security. So that's using that, again, national security buzzword to block actions against the government. Afterwards, I was involved in an operation to curtail Iranian nuclear weapons development. And it was flawed from the beginning. And actually, it turned out to be more dangerous than I had been told about. And I thought it was a situation that needed to be told to the proper authorities. I voiced my concerns internally with the CIA, and then I voiced my concerns with the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committees. Subsequently, after that, seems that everything that I told to the Senate Intelligence Committee wound it into a book written by a reporter. So I was then, of course, the only finger was pointed at me as being the so-called leak. And I think my experience showed the flaw in the so-called protections for whistleblowers that the government here will tout. I was charged with violating the Espionage Act. I went to trial. I did not agree to anything they had to say, and I wasn't going to plead guilty to something that I did not do. It was an interesting trial. It was pretty much a showcase for the CIA to show how they do things correctly. And as I have described before, the only thing they proved beyond a reasonable doubt in that trial was that I was black. They put me on a pedestal and painted me as an enemy, as a nonconformist, if you will. And I was convicted. I spent 2.5 years in prison. The experience for me is a bit different from others, in the sense I didn't take the step to go to the press, but I won't fault anyone for doing that. I mean, to take the step anyway, to raise concerns, to blow the whistle, it takes such fortitude and strength to do that. And my advice to anyone, and I may not be the best poster child for whistleblowing is you stick to your convictions. There was something about you that set off bells and alarms within you about what you've been seeing and how wrong it is. And you have to stick to your guns, because there's going to be a tremendous amount of pushback against you. But if you stick with who you are, I think a difference can be made. Whistleblowers are like everyone else. They love and have concerns for their country or their industry or other things that they're involved in. And they take the steps to make sure things are done right. And whistleblowing is essential. It's a minefield, absolutely. But in my experience, I would not have done anything differently. I know who I am. I know what I didn't do. And I wasn't going to let my government push me around. And I fought. I may have lost, but that's a fight they're never going to forget.
May I add one more comment, Iain? A CIA psychiatrist once told me that the CIA actively seeks to hire people who have sociopathic tendencies. Not sociopaths, because sociopaths have no conscience and they blow right through a polygraph exam and they're impossible to control. But people who have sociopathic tendencies have a conscience, but are still willing to break the law and to operate within gray areas, moral, ethical, legal gray areas. The problem is that the polygraph on which the CIA is so heavily dependent can't weed out sociopaths. As I said, because they lack a conscience, they don't react on polygraph exams. And so just like in corporate America, sociopaths rise to the top of the CIA's leadership. And so you end up with an organization that goes rogue if it doesn't have any appropriate oversight. And God knows the CIA hasn't had appropriate oversight since the 1970s or the early 1980s. And we end up with things like a torture program or extraordinary renditions or an archipelago of secret prisons around the world. I think that you've got to get to the heart of that sociopathy if you're going to reform the CIA. And nobody has the guts or even the basic outline of a plan to do that.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks very much, Jeffrey. Absolutely amazing, incredible stories of courage and persecution and corruption, of course, of a very dangerous organization. We've got a few questions, and Jeremy Hammond, I know you've already answered him in the chat, but would you mind unmuting yourself and asking the question? And if anyone else has any questions, just to in this early point in the debate before we move on to the other speakers, please. Jeremy, would you like to ask a question? Sorry, we seem to be having some problem. Here he comes. Does anyone mind if I just ask Jeremy's question? Jeremy basically asks, is the CIA reformable or should it be closed down? Would either of you like to talk to that question?
I'll take a shot. I think there is a role for intelligence. I think, though, there has to be oversight. You have to be able to call these the individuals charged with protecting the country and the national security to be able to be accountable. Our representatives, our government does a horrible job of calling the CIA out on its indiscretions. The CIA sits up on top of a mountain and they know that they can get away with pretty much anything that they want because no one's going to challenge them, especially in these days. You challenge the CIA, you're quite un-American, and that's a buzzword for going after you. So we need our elected officials and our government officials to not be afraid to take on the CIA. I mean, when was the last time in any election in this country anyone ran on the motto of "I'm going to reform the CIA"? I think it's been quite a while. And I think until that happens, until we get people wanting to contain this beast that has just been growing and growing and growing, until that happens, they're going to continue unfettered with whatever they want to do and claim it in the name of national security and hide behind classification to continue doing what they have been doing. So while there is a need for intelligence, I don't think there's a need for uncontrolled measures to gain that intelligence or to so-called police the world the way we've been doing.
I couldn't agree more. I might go a little bit farther. Intelligence is duplicated throughout government. The State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research does analysis, like the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence. The Defense Department's Defense Human Services does human source collection, like the CIA's Directorate of Operations. NSA does interception, like the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. DARPA does the scientific development, like science and technology. There are all these duplicative efforts all over government. And when you've got an organization that has gone rogue several times over the course of recent American history, I think there is no reason to have a CIA, especially when there are already other organizations spread around government doing exactly the same thing, but with better, more direct oversight. So I think we don't need a CIA, besides the fact that the CIA has gotten literally nothing right since it was created in 1947. Everything from the Cold War to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and 9/11, and name a major historical event, and the CIA either didn't predict it or predicted it incorrectly. And so I think this is a waste of billions upon billions of dollars of the taxpayers' money, and it comes to nothing more than support for a criminal organization.
Thanks very much. Great, really interesting answers. Could I ask the other panelists whether they have any questions before we move on to their own presentations and views? Do the panelists have any questions?
I'd just like to ask John Kiriakou, are you trying to tell me that Timber Sycamore wasn't a success?
I suppose we can go through history and find individual operational successes, but then you have to look at things like, let's say, Operation Paperclip, which, even if I put myself in a 1947 mindset, I can't imagine how anybody thought that was a good idea. Or Operation Mockingbird, where someone came up with a bright idea of recruiting as many members of the American media as possible. Knowing that it's illegal to propagandize the American people. Going back to these major global events, no, they just kept getting it wrong. I'll give you one anecdote, Jimmy. I worked for a guy who made his bones during the Vietnam War in analysis, and he told me this story that he was an imagery analyst. So he's looking at overhead photography, and he's watching the North Vietnamese build this road. And he reported it. There's this new road. It's cutting through the jungle. And every week or 2 weeks, he would write an update for the president's daily brief. And then he got called in to Johnson's Oval Office to give a briefing on this road and how it's going through the jungle. And they're not sure where it's going, but maybe it's going to China. And what does it mean? And this went on for years. And then he got promoted and finally moved on. Well, Then, we open relations with the Vietnamese. The war is long over. He goes to Vietnam for an intelligence exchange, and he's meeting with some 80-year-old former North Vietnamese general. And he said, I have to ask you about this road. We followed the development of this road for years. And he said, the general said, oh, yeah, the road? Yeah, we needed a road. There were no roads in the area, so we built the road. It had no intelligence import. There was no intelligence value. It was just a road, for God's sake, like every country in the world builds at one time or another. But billions of dollars were spent moving satellites so that they're sitting on top of the road, and we can get these images within 24 hours of the passing of the satellite, and teams of analysts all with their light tables looking at the construction and trying to identify the construction vehicles on the side of the road. I mean, this is what people do at the CIA every day.
Any other comments from the panelists, please?
What about when they spied on the Senate? Was that successful?
Yeah. Talk about an overt criminal act. Listen, I'm on record as saying that John Brennan should spend the rest of his life in prison anyway. But to order your hackers to hack into the Senate Intelligence Committee's computer system is just beyond the pale. And the fact that when then Chairwoman Feinstein reported it as a crime, she made a criminal referral to the Justice Department. The response from the CIA was to refer Feinstein to the Justice Department as part of a criminal referral. And then to have the Attorney General say, okay, everybody, let's just take it easy. Nobody's going to be investigated. Nobody's going to prison. And then, the Washington Post and the New York Times say, okay, well, that worked out fine for everybody. Shame on all of that.
Yeah, I'll add something to that. You at the same, anything that comes up with CIA would be ready to pounce to do something, especially on with the intelligence committees. Well, what has happened is that the intelligence community, and particularly the CIA, they've been stuffing these committees with former intelligence officials, former intelligence employees. When I went to the Senate Intelligence Committee, the staffers I was able to have contact with were both had a former career, or were still with CIA. So they're using the Senate Intelligence Committee as their eyes and ears for anyone who's going to be doing anything against them. So they don't have to do any covert intelligence right now, or there's no need to do that. They're doing it in the open because they're staffing these committees with individuals who will be who serve as a direct line right back to the CIA. And that's exactly what happened with my situation. So you'd think that, based on history, that members of these committees would be quite eager to go after the CIA, yet they don't. There's still that fear, I think, of being viewed as un-American, or fear of CIA in general.
Any more questions or points from the panelists themselves about the first two speakers? Fascinating discussion. Thanks. Any further points? Okay, thanks very much, John and Jeffrey. Absolutely brilliant presentations. For the next part of the this workshop, I want to bring in a range of journalists, lawyers, and political activists to talk about their own views on how they support whistleblowers, how they support dissent and democracy and freedom. If it's okay, should we go in alphabetical order? So that would be either Michael Alberts, if you're here, or Max Blumenthal.
Michael Alberts here. If you want, I can sort out the... Michael, you'll need to unmute yourself. Michael, you'll need to unmute. Is there any chance somebody's locked Michael So hopefully that should work now. Michael, is that you, Michael Albert? Okay, could we go with Max Blumenthal, Iain? I'm hoping that if Michael works out how he can unmute himself, then we can go with him.
Sure. Max, are you around? Can you? Brilliant.
Yeah, can you all hear me? Okay. I don't have any video because I'm actually at a family event, sort of in the woods. So I hope this comes through at least. And I might have to step away after this. But it's been fascinating so far. And thank you so much to Deepa Driver for organizing this incredible Woodstock Burning Man of really courageous whistleblowers and truth tellers. And I'm really humbled to be among all of you. I guess the question, I don't really have a presentation prepared, but the question was, how do I support whistleblowers? I guess I'll make a few points based on the discussion and talk about really briefly, as briefly as I can, given how much I love the sound of my own voice, some of the work we've been doing at the Gray Zone. And I really think Aaron Mate should have been here because of the work he's doing defending whistleblowers at the OPCW, which I'll talk about briefly. But right now, the people of Colombia, or a substantial portion of the people in Colombia, are in the streets, taking bodies, protesting the neoliberal austerity regime of a right-wing US-backed government that is really controlled by this kind of narco dictatorship that was imposed under Plan Colombia by which Joseph Biden, the president, has taken personal credit for ushering through the Senate. And really, it was a counterinsurgency program that consolidated the militarization of Colombian society in order to essentially exterminate the FARC and the leftist insurgency. And what Colombia has turned into, we see in the streets, where police, hyper-militarized police, are gunning down protesters. I think 25 have been killed, maybe 30. And one of the US government's favorite dissidents, who is a right-wing coup plotter named Leopoldo Lopez from next door in Venezuela, who is now living in a luxury mansion in Spain under the protection of NATO, the US government, and presumably the CIA, stepped out of his mansion. He's basically the boss of Juan Guaido, the fake president of Venezuela, who the US is backing. He stepped out and he spoke up yesterday to condemn the protesters of Colombia and to tell them that they should be grateful for the wonderful democracy that has been gifted to them, and that they should be grateful for Iván Duque, who is this right-wing tyrannical leader who presides over basically a military and a bunch of narco gangs. And Leopoldo Lopez has been designated by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience. But you know who has not been designated as a prisoner of conscience? Julian Assange. Amnesty International has declared explicitly that Julian Assange is not a prisoner of conscience. Same with Chelsea Manning, not a prisoner of conscience. And so we've seen this betrayal of Julian Assange again and again by the human rights industrial complex, which increasingly acts as a force multiplier for US empire and the State Department. And it's, of a part with the Committee to Protect Journalists, which has improved its position on Assange, declaring in 2019 that he was not a journalist. And I've spoken out against these groups. There's a betrayal, of course, within the media. And so what we've done at the Gray Zone, first and foremost, is supporting Julian Assange, but also showing how he has been targeted as a journalist, specifically and for what he published, and using those publications and what some of the most dangerous publications, I think, for his safety were not merely collateral murder and the more well-known revelations that appeared on WikiLeaks, but the State Department cables from Cablegate, which really show how the sausage is made with US empire. They show how the embassies across the globe, but particularly in countries where the US is running effectively regime change operations, are recruiting assets. They are using the embassies as cover for CIA operations, and they are destabilizing governments or setting the stage, as we saw with the cables on Syria, for a dirty war. Jimmy just alluded to it with Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the delivery of some $2 billion of weapons to Salafi jihadi gangs. It amounted to $1 out of every $13 out of the CIA budget. That was so disruptive to US imperial interests that Assange had to be made, they had to make an example of them. And I was able to provide a look into how the CIA targeted Assange through an investigation I conducted at the Gray Zone, the site that I edit, by working with documents that were leaked out of the trial of UC Global's CEO. That was the executive of a Spanish mercenary firm, which got a CIA contract to basically infiltrate the Ecuadorian embassy where Assange was seeking asylum and being and taking sanctuary. And they basically, what UC Global did was invade Julian Assange's privacy, violate his legal privilege, spy on meetings he held with lawyers, spy on meetings he even had with Ecuadorian officials, spy on meetings he had with journalists. And every single journalist, including journalists from the Washington Post, NPR, major publications across the world, when they entered the embassy, thought they were handing their devices to an embassy security guard, but these were people who had actually been recruited by the CIA. So this trial in Madrid that's been taking place of UC Global is actually the CIA on trial. The CEO of UC Global was arrested by Spanish police as part of an investigation into the crimes he committed against Assange. And the trial demonstrates why extraditing Assange to the US, which the Biden administration is still seeking, is simply a major violation of international law, violation of torture conventions, and he will be prevented from having any legal defense because his meetings with his legal team have already been spied on by the CIA. So that investigation really gave me a chance to defend Assange as a fellow journalist and show solidarity with him, not just as a whistleblower, but as a fellow journalist and publisher. I'm a publisher as well. And I will just relate one recent event, which I thought was really disturbing or unsettling and also kind of funny, which was that at the Gray Zone, we look to WikiLeaks as an example of what journalists are supposed to do. Julian Assange said that if wars can be started with lies, they can be stopped with the truth. So we need radical transparency. And that means that if documents come to us, which are hacked or obtained through hacking, and they're in the public interest, we will write about them, we will cover them, we will publish them, just like the New York Times and Washington Post did with documents that WikiLeaks produced. And I recently did that with documents that were published first by what called itself a hacktivist collective, anonymous, could have been anything. Hey, for all I know, it could have been Russian hackers, but I saw these documents as in the public interest. I understood what they were about. They were documents from the British Foreign Office, which showed how Reuters and the BBC were acting basically as in tandem with British intelligence to, in their own words, in appeals they made for Foreign Office contracts, weaken Russia. And what they were doing was recruiting Russian journalists, taking them to train them as British intelligence assets and send them back to Russia and create networks. They were setting up fake independent media networks, including in the Donbass, and they were doing this under cover of BBC, Media Action, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I also found documents in there showing Bellingcat, the supposed open source journalist collective doing very much the same thing, going into elections across Europe, where the UK Foreign Office and State Department had an interest in seeing a pro-NATO outcome and training the pro-NATO side's media complex, their media network. And they were being, it looked like their tickets and their whole trips were being paid for by the British Foreign Office. This was all being done covertly. So I published that story at the Gray Zone. It generated an impact. It got a good audience reception. I woke up the next day and I saw that Twitter had put a special label on that article so that anytime anyone tweeted that article out, a warning label, a soft censorship label appeared that said these materials may, this article contains materials that may have been obtained through hacking. Anytime anyone tweeted the link out, that label would come up. If you wanted to like the article or retweet the article, you had to go through a second verification where Twitter asks you, are you sure that you want to retweet this? Are you sure you want to like this article? Many people who liked the article saw that their browser would immediately crash. Twitter was doing whatever it could
Got a bit of irony there, I think.
to protect what we, and in closing, I found one of the most remarkable events or experiences in my 20 years in journalism took place, where basically young people who are not even politically engaged realized that if they tweeted that link with a funny GIF or a funny image, that the label would come up. These materials may have been obtained through hacking. So they would tweet like Alvin and the Chipmunks having an orgy or something completely bizarre. The gamers got into it. And all of a sudden, this article went viral in a way that no article we have ever published has. And it started to reach audiences we've never reached before. Then the next day, I saw that Bellingcat CIA was trending. And people were starting to realize, yes, Bellingcat was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the regime change arm of the US government, which was spun out of William Casey's CIA in the Reagan administration. According to one of its founding directors, it was founded to do what the CIA did covertly in the open. And so the public was reacting with so much enthusiasm to see that the media they knew was manipulating them was actually, in fact, working with the intelligence, so-called intelligence community. That Operation Mockingbird was no longer about just paying a few journalists. It was the very essence, the heart of these major mainstream media organizations, Reuters being the largest media organization in the world, the most employees. So the public supports this kind of journalism. The public supports whistleblowers, and it cuts across partisan lines. It really does give me hope about Julian Assange. Those who don't support them are the media elites who participate in this kind of intelligence community quid pro quo for access, who actually believe in the mission of the CIA and the State Department. And they are the ones who are not only showing solidarity, but who help demonize Julian Assange. They truly are, in my view, an enemy of the people, an enemy of democracy. And so what we also do to support whistleblowers is we expose those who are depriving them of the justice they deserve. And I guess I'll just end it there.
Thanks very much, Max.
Thanks for having me.
Really insightful and a very important point, common to many of the panelists present, the role of the alternative media and independent activists in supporting whistleblowers when they're being demonized by mainstream media.
And I would say Jimmy's been such a source of support for us, and he's been hosting. I would encourage everyone to watch his recent interview with my colleague Aaron Mate about the OPCW whistleblowers and the Duma deception. And Jimmy is bringing these stories to such a massive audience. So I really owe him a lot of credit.
Thanks, Max. Okay, so should we move on to the next speaker? Michael Albert, are you able to speak now, or shall we move on to Jimmy Dore? If not,
Okay. Oh, can you hear me? Everything good? Okay. Well, I don't know what all the whining is about today about the whistleblowing, because people whistleblow and they don't nothing bad. When David Petraeus, General Petraeus, leaked high sensitive information to his lover, who was a journalist, he got offered a spot at the Kennedy School of Government. I mean, I don't see what the problem is. Of course, I'm kidding. Yeah. So if you're aiding the establishment's imperialism, then when you commit actual crimes of illegally sharing top secret information, there's no punishment for someone like David Petraeus. He's now at this Kennedy School of Government. He's at another college in England. He was given $200,000 contract by the City College of New York. I mean, so again, there's never a price to pay if you lie at the behest of the establishment and imperialism. And the thing is that, with people like Julian Assange, it's the journalism has let journalism down. Journalists won't even stick up for their own profession, which is hilarious to me, which is why someone like me, a nightclub comedian, can do better reporting about things like Syria, Yemen, Libya, Venezuela, high from my garage than they do with billion-dollar backings, like at The Intercept, right? Like I just covered this the other day. The Intercept just re-released, or the guy who wrote, James Harkin, wrote his story about Syria, and it was nothing but CIA talking points and misinformation. And I retweeted and I said, Jack, why is this allowed to be on Twitter? This is a conspiracy theory that has been debunked already by the OPCW. But of course, that'll never happen. No, because Bellingcat lies at the behest of the establishment and imperialism in the CIA, right? And the Intercept lies at the behest of, and that's the irony of the Intercept being founded by Glenn Greenwald and to expose centers of power. And now what the Intercept has turned into is one of those places that does not challenge the centers of power, but their new initiative is to go through a data dump from Gab, a right-wing social media outlet, and that now Intercept wants you to donate to their billionaire-funded organization so they can now spy on regular powerless people and try to expose them for bad things they're saying on a social media app. So that's the kind of garbage that we have. And the Intercept is considered lefty media still. I have no idea how that is. They take, if you're a good reporter and you go to work at the Intercept, you immediately become garbage. Jeremy Scahill can't even remember how to do a follow-up question. That they don't teach that anymore at the Intercept. Nor does he understand that John Kerry, his latest investigation stops at Syria. So we don't have any idea what's going on. So the people who are calling, so I can give voice to someone like Julian Assange or John Kiriakou or Aramates or the OPCW whistleblowers, or I can I bring Tulsi Gabbard on when she's telling the truth about our dirty wars in Syria, or Timber Sycamore. But then what happens is the Washington Post, CNN, the Intercept, or the Young Turks will then smear me and call me a conspiracy theorist, which they've done. In fact, if you go to my Wikipedia, which is also in bed with the intelligence community, which is another problem. People think Wikipedia is neutral, which they're not. They're in bed with the intelligence communities. And so what they do is then they have CNN says Jimmy Dore is spreading false conspiracies about the Syrian gas attacks. They're calling them hoaxes. And that goes, they were hoaxes. That we've been proven that they were. But then that goes in my Wikipedia page because a guy, a right-wing hack hired by Jeff Bezos, who's in bed with the CIA, writes that article, sticks my name in it, and then so now I'm tarnished for the rest of my career. And that's another thing the Washington Post doesn't do, is they don't they're supposed to disclose that they have a $600 million deal with the CIA, which is worth like 3 times what the paper's worth. Their deal with the CIA. They're supposed to disclose that when they write about stuff that has to do with the CIA. They don't do that. And that's unethical, and no one cares. So this idea that we have journalism in the United States is a joke, right? Which is why I can do better journalism than The Intercept, which is funded by a guy who's got $23 billion in his bank account, and they go write an article on Syria, and it's all garbage. because they're not there to tell you the truth. There is no left in America. There is no journalism left in America. We just saw Russiagate was a 5-year-long conspiracy theory that was evidence-free, and now those same people that touted that are trying to say that somehow people who are doing QAnon are crazier than they are, which there are equal amounts of crazy. The difference is not everybody on the right believes QAnon, but everybody on the left believes Russiagate. That's amazing. So we're living in crazy times when we have to rely on people like me who are going to be squashed. Right now, the CEO of YouTube admitted that they're throttling us. They want to rely on authoritative news. You mean the authoritative news that sold us the Iraq war, that said they had weapons of mass destruction? The authoritative news that printed talking points out of Dick Cheney's mouth on the front page of the New York Times? You mean that authoritative news, or the authoritative news that says that Assad is gassing his own people, even though he's not, and journalists on the ground are debunking it in real time? So that's the weird thing. Like, why doesn't The Intercept, the New York Times, the Washington Post, James Harkin at The Intercept, why don't they know about the reporting that I know about? Why don't they ever? Well, because it would hurt their career if they actually did it, if they actually told the truth about this stuff. So there's only 6 companies that run all the media in the United States. My program airs on YouTube, which is owned by Google, so which is in bed with the intelligence community. Which I just did a story, which they're enabling the CIA. They're actually doing the spying for the CIA on social media now. So I don't really see a way out of this, and because what the people in America think is hurting journalism is what Trump was doing to Jim Acosta. That wasn't hurting journalism. Jim Acosta is a clown, right? It's what Trump and now Joe Biden is doing to Julian Assange. When Barack Obama tortured Chelsea Manning, nobody ever talks about that they tortured him. Why didn't Barack Obama ever prosecute any of the torturers from the from the George Bush administration? Because they were complicit in torture. Nancy Pelosi is complicit in torture. She knew about the torture program and didn't do anything about it. So how is she going to have a hearing to prosecute people for torture, which she would have to prosecute herself? That's why that never happens. And then they have to impeach Donald Trump, and it took them so long to find a crime that they were against. That's the whole thing. He's committing crimes all over the place. Do you see how long it took for them to find a crime that they actually could be against? And anyway, so I just I salute people like John Kiriakou and Max and Aaron Mate and the whistleblowers at the OPCW, and all I'm doing is getting my reputation dragged through the mud. But I don't care. I never had any credibility. I don't need it. I'm a comedian. So they don't know what to do to me. They can't hurt me. I don't have a boss. I'm not looking for a job. I don't have a manager. They have called Noam Chomsky, but I don't work for him. So I don't have to listen to him either. So I just salute, but what people don't realize is that, they used to have to infiltrate. The CIA used to have to infiltrate newsrooms. Now MSNBC and CNN hire them on air as analysts. You're supposed to bring somebody in to debunk the CIA's bullshit. You're not supposed to bring the CIA in to tell you what's going on. So that's how, we're living in completely corrupted times, which is why someone like me can do a show like mine that gets popular, because just like Max said, there's a thirst for this out there and people aren't getting it. And they're never going to get it. It's going to only get worse, and that's why I keep saluting people who continue to blow whistles. If I had something to lose, I don't know if I would, because there is just Bill. I'm not as smart as Bill Binney. He outsmarted the FBI when they tried to frame him. I'm not that smart, so if they want to frame me, I'm sure I'll be in jail. So, but I'll be here doing whatever I can, and. The Julian Assange thing happening right in broad daylight, and no one on the left holding Joe Biden accountable for that, just goes to show you there is no left in America. Nothing. And we live in a corporate oligarchy, a rapacious oligarchy, and your democracy has been stolen from you a long time ago. So I just salute the whistleblowers, and I'll keep trying to publicize them. I'll end it there.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. That was that was great. Can I move to a slightly different perspective now, that of a human rights activist? Chamira, would you mind just telling us a bit about your work and support for whistleblowers and so on? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just to say a big thank you again for having me today, and really nice to be on this panel with everyone. The topics that are being discussed today are, a big passion area for me personally, and incredibly complex, and something I'm trying to bring further to the human rights space. And to, Max's delight, I'm actually working at Amnesty International in the philanthropy team, and also an active campaigner on Assange. So probably my primary focus being, how do we get more traction for Assange? So it's probably a bit of insight I can provide there. And outside of that as well, I'm building a online community called Thinkers, sort of brainstorming the intersection between movement building, awareness, and tech, and trying to achieve long-term generational outcomes on the issues that we're talking about today. And our thesis was that critical thinking was the binding conduit, between challenging, understanding how all the issues that we're talking about today when it comes to online misinformation, how the narrative can be shaped through media, how conversation can get labeled and shut down, as Jimmy mentioned as well, with certain words, and allowing people the ability to see through that. We think critical thinking really is the long-term way, and meeting people where they are online. So to kind of, bring it all in, I suppose, accountability is the cornerstone of, of democracy. Freedom of speech and ideas is really the playing field to progress as a society, to allow people to really get to the nuance and the grey, and even with Max, the grey zone. I think finding that grey and being comfortable in it, instead of having labels on, very black and white labels, it kind of fragments people into different echo chambers and polarizes them even further than they already are, right? And the algorithms that are being, used online on social and news, they literally are there just to hold your attention, to drive more traffic, to drive more fear, and they just continue that polarization into these different fragmented groups, so that you don't see what the other side's saying, you don't consider the nuance, you just kind of are in an echo chamber of everyone agrees with what I'm saying, and that's it. So finding a way forward with that is a big part, but I think movement building is the key, because one reason why I joined Amnesty from the beginning was the notion of people power. And regardless of, the different perspectives people may have on Amnesty, even myself, there's no doubt that works. And it is probably the strongest way to challenge and hold governments accountable and large institutions accountable. So there are many examples in recent times I could even draw upon when it comes to refugee issues in Australia, even journalism in Australia, where, ABC, which is like the public broadcaster, a lady called Annika Smethurst was, her home was raided by the government just to see if there are any documentation there that would be compromising. And it kind of kicked off that wave of, a tough hand on journalism, both in Australia and around the world. But we did see that, with awareness, online actions, lobbying in private with governments and perhaps legal teams, which is exactly what happened with the Assange situation as well. A combination of speaking to the legal team in private, so not to jeopardize anything, talking to government officials to see if they're, we can continue to lobby them and get them to reach out to the US. So a lot of the strategy has actually been driven from Australia and our team to really highlight this issue and figure out and brainstorm, how do we get the public to unravel, all the perception that's been put forward in mainstream media. As we all know here, that was a targeted sort of campaign, right? Online and in mainstream media. So that was an education piece, an awareness piece, and bridging everything we're saying today and making sure that it's not just preaching to people that already agree with us, but how do we get that to the vast majority, and especially the younger generation, who, if they are aware of these topics earlier, have a much bigger chance of doing something and joining groups long term, right? And banding together and holding governments to account. So yeah, it's been a tough piece and a long term build. personally, I'm actually quite optimistic and hopeful when I've seen the sentiment change in the last 2 years when it comes to Assange. When we, when ramped up time period, it was still very much a set group of people that were asking for more action to be done or speaking to us. And then over time, in coalition with many other groups, obviously, we noticed people from perhaps the right or people that you would not expect to be favorable towards Julian start to, even online, as if they had to like avail themselves of their sins or the words they've said like, years ago. They actually said, you know what, I want to apologize for my thoughts and my opinion of Assange. I want to say, actually, I think that, we do need to stand up for him and he shouldn't be extradited. So I've seen a public sentiment shift, and that's what I'm most fascinated about, is getting that dial moving with the public. And there is a bit more of a shift now, actually significant shift compared to before, where it's now even a bit of a given that you would support Assange's plight and the knock-on effect towards freedom. Again, there is a lot of people that say, look, the way this issue is being communicated, it seems very exclusive or complicated, or I don't know how to touch this. So I think, again, that communication piece on bringing that to the wider audiences is really important. And we were speaking about this on Clubhouse the other day with Christian from WikiLeaks as well, and how do you really funnel this information so that it's not touchy, we understand the issue and I want to help, how do I help? And that, I think, is probably the strongest way to kind of have that governmental change. So yeah, I would say that, so important what's going on today and these topics, and I do sense that the younger generation in particular is more open to them and wants to get more involved. Movement building is more accessible, but I do think that being very aware of how we're targeted online and how more and more people are spending their times online, which even creates the reality they see in real life, right? It's kind of being formed in online groups and communities and then translating, as opposed to how it's been, where people meet in person and then do it online now. So that's something just to be aware of. And yeah, I think we have to treat all of this with optimism and keep pushing on.
Thanks very much, Chamira. Could I just want to have one quick follow-up question, because quite a few people have commented on it in the chat function. And
Sure.
Given that Amnesty, for example, came quite late to support Assange, he'd been in trouble for quite a long time, and other human rights organizations such as the UN had got interested. Is there something particular about whistleblowers, do you think, that make it that you might support a journalist or a political activist, but more reluctant to support a whistleblower? Would that be true or not?
Yeah, I could also just to mention that there has actually been consistent support from Amnesty year on year, multiple points throughout the year, from about 2009 onwards. He was actually awarded an Amnesty Award for journalism. But yeah, I mean, I can agree that certainly it's ramped up in the last 2 years really, and that was a bit of an active campaign. When it comes to whistleblowers in particular, there's been a lot of support for Bernard Colleroy here in Australia, David McBride, and certainly raising awareness for these issues. I mean, yeah, again, there's so many that come up on a day-to-day basis around the world that need to be addressed. And in terms of whether there's a set lens that they're looked at, to be honest, I'm not aware of that. Like, I generally have no idea. We kind of just focus on how we can campaign and raise as much awareness and get it over the line. But yeah, there seems to be a level of support. I guess how we're different to Human Rights Watch is that we have the 10 million supporters that go out on the ground, sign petitions, take part in that next step. I think Human Rights Watch is very research focused. So I guess the different organizations, have their own sort of approaches. But to be honest, yeah, I can't really comment on that. I'm not too sure.
Thanks very much. That was a great presentation, very insightful. Thanks a lot. Lauria, do you feel able and ready to speak on the subject of independent journalism, whistleblowing, and dissent, please? Free. I think still muted, I think.
Yeah, Joe? I'll try calling Joe on the phone. Iain, perhaps you want to move to the next speaker?
In that case, Stephen Rohde, is it Rohde?
Yes,
Would you be willing to talk next?
I will, and
Thanks.
I'm eager to be sure we have time to go back to Joe and the other speakers. It's a privilege to be in this festival. A friend of mine, when they logged in, said, Whistleblower Festival, is this something to celebrate? And it is. I'm especially proud to be on this panel. This panel and others that I've observed are the next chapters in Profiles in Courage. And I'm particularly proud to be on this program with John Kiriakou. John is a friend. John and I were able to work together to review a book called Enhanced Interrogation, written by the torturer, James Mitchell. And I hope anyone who wants to go to Los Angeles Review of Books to see what John and I put together to expose James Mitchell, who created the torture program and implemented it. I've done a lot of work on freedom of speech here in America for the last 45 years, representing protesters and advocates and marginalized groups and individuals who are struggling to express themselves against all odds in this country. I see in this panel and in this program that democracy really has been inverted. Why are people like Jeffrey Sterling and John Kiriakou going to jail? People like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden are in exile, and Julian Assange, reality winner who needs to be mentioned in this context, and people like George Bush, Dick Cheney, and a man I particularly despise, John Yoo, who was the lawyer who wrote the torture memo that led to waterboarding and the rationalization of torture. I once was on a program and got to call John Yoo a war criminal to his face, but he gets a distinguished scholar attention. He is extolled in the mainstream academic and legal community. So that's the kind of personal inversion, that the wrong people are in jail and the right people should be in jail. But more broadly, the United States is not a democracy in which personal privacy enjoys broad protection, and the government largely functions in the open as it was and should be conceived of. Quite the opposite. Increasingly, private individuals and organizations are subject to unprecedented surveillance and invasions of privacy in their lives and political activities and protests, while the government is able to operate largely behind a heavy cloak of secrecy, protected by a thicket of laws and regulations, court rulings, policies, and norms that undermine and in fact criminalize efforts to expose official wrongdoing, illegality, mendacity, and corruption. And that's what we are examining in this conference. The world deserves to know what its governments are doing so that people can fulfill the ideals of self-government. And this is all the more true in a period when we put out of office a man who lied to the world 30,000 times and continues to expose the big lie. The problem, it seems to me, is that we have hyper secrecy in the United States, in the examination I'm giving it, particularly in the national security area, where there is an epidemic of over-classification of vital information. And with unwarranted government secrecy, it sets the stage for leaks and whistleblowing, which in recent years has resulted in an unprecedented number of criminal prosecutions that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, mainstream media this year is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Pentagon Papers case. And there's no doubt that in ruling 6-3, the Supreme Court said that the Nixon administration had failed to meet its burden to engage in a prior restraint, imposing an injunction on the New York Times and the Washington Post, preventing them from publishing the Pentagon Papers. But a lot of people miss the fact that that case left open serious threats to freedom of the press. A prior restraint is still on the books. It could still be upheld if the government presents to 5 out of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court, which has 6 conservatives anyway, to deem it appropriate to overcome the presumption against prior restraints. That would have a devastating effect. The Pentagon Papers case offered no protection for whistleblowing and leaks, and we know that because Daniel Ellsberg was actually criminally prosecuted for the Pentagon Papers case, and his case was only thrown out because of prosecutorial misconduct at the time. And finally, the court has yet to decide whether the press possesses a right to elicit classified information from the government. And that brings us to the question of Julian Assange, because there is no general constitutional right of the public to have access to information in the hands of the government. We have the Freedom of Information Act, which is riddled with exceptions and is hugely difficult to prosecute. The overclassification has been noted at congressional hearings. People have said that between 50 and 90% of classified information has been mislabeled. And what we have, and it was alluded to by an earlier speaker, is a wonderful selective process of leaks. The government's only too happy to leak information freely to the New York Times and elsewhere to get front page stories, which are really press releases for the government. And Judith Miller was guilty of that. She went to jail for the wrong reason when she was protecting her confidential sources. I'm not putting any journalist in jail for anything, but what I mean by that is that uncritically she delivered White House press releases on the front page of the New York Times when leaks are favorable to the government, and we jail people when they are not. Edward Snowden needs to be lifted up in the context of a program of this kind, because since his leaks, people have credited him with bringing the National Security Agency and FBI tapping of phones and extracting audio and video chats and emails and documents to the American public. The problem is that when the New York Times and the Washington Post publish that material, and this alludes to Assange, of course, they get Pulitzer Prizes for doing that, while Snowden sits in exile and Julian Assange is struggling away in prison. Chelsea Manning spent time in prison. And in all of this, we are using the Espionage Act of 1917, an outmoded, blunt instrument that needed to have been amended or repealed far earlier, because it has led to 18 cases of journalist sources, 2 of whom proudly sit on this panel today. In my work, I found a quote by Hannah Arendt, which I think is relevant as I bring my remarks to a close. In 1974, she warned us that if everyone always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything anymore. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It's deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please with them. As we are gathering people in this conference with such important speakers and such important issues, we have US Congress people traveling America, feeding the big lie, so that 70% of Republicans do not believe that Joe Biden was elected president of the United States. That is what we have come to. I do believe there is a left in America. I know it because in the civil liberties circles that I travel in the interfaith circles that I travel in, which is an entire constituency we should not ignore in a program of this kind, prophetic, religious, progressive leaders who have seen through what Bush was doing 20 years ago. That's the kind of work we're doing. And I want to end by encouraging people, if they will end these events after Q&A, by asking themselves, what are we going to do about it? You could do nothing less than go to the Assange Defense Committee at assangedefense.org. I'm on the steering committee of the Los Angeles chapter of that group. We have chapters in New York City and Chicago and Milwaukee and Denver and Washington, D.C. and Boston. That's the National American Group, co-chaired by Daniel Ellsberg, Noam Chomsky, and Alice Walker. It is intolerable that the Biden administration and Department of Justice have sustained the Trump indictment of Julian Assange. The extradition judge gave an opening by ruling that Julian Assange's mental and physical condition did not equip him to stand trial. So technically, she denied the extradition petition, but she embedded in her 180-page ruling some of the most terrible findings against journalists, against freedom of the press. The US government should withdraw its appeal of that ruling as far as trying to overturn the ruling against extradition. Anyone in America that's listening to my voice should be contacting their US senators, their US congresspersons. We must demand that the Biden administration demonstrate its purported faith in freedom of speech and freedom of the press by withdrawing the appeal. And it's not enough just to not extradite Julian Assange. He should be released from prison and he should be compensated for the human rights violations and the torture he has been exposed to, so that he can return to his wife and children, try to rebuild his life, and then, for the sake of all of us, return to the job at WikiLeaks and elsewhere of exposing government corruption and government wrongdoing. That's the task that lays ahead of us. None of us should despair. This is a movement. The very fact that we can gather internationally for a program of this kind is a demonstration that we need to speak truth to power. And with the kind of know-how and intellect and encouragement of panels like this and this entire program, I'm convinced that we can shift this dynamic. We can shift back to a model in which the people's rights of speech and privacy are protected and the government is exposed. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for those insights into the double standards by which leakers are handled and prosecuted, and also those very stirring comments in support of Julian Assange. Joe Lauria, we're really looking forward to your discussion of your vast knowledge of working in journalism, independent journalism, the mainstream media, but also your views on Dissent, the Espionage Act, and anything else you'd like to tell us. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Iain, and thank you, Deepa, for organizing and letting me. I won't be as Steve, certainly not as funny as Jim. But, yes, I have a background in mainstream media. For almost 30 years, I worked for the Sunday Times, London Sunday Times, in their investigative unit, and at the UN headquarters in New York. I covered international affairs for 25 years for the Daily Mail, for the Daily Telegraph, for the Boston Globe, for Southern News, a Canadian chain that published the Montreal Gazette, Ottawa Citizen, Vancouver Sun, a bunch of other papers. Some of them fired me the very day of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 because I had refused a directive that was a call from their foreign editor that I had to support the war. And I was reporting what was going on at the Security Council, which was an extremely important place leading up to the war. And then I worked for the Wall Street Journal for 6 years covering the UN. And as they started suppressing several of my stories critical of US foreign policy, I began slipping them to Bob Perry, who, of course, who started Consortium News in 1995. Bob was an investigative reporter at AP Newsweek, who broke many of the Iran-Contra stories. His stories were being spiked by AP and Newsweek. That's why he started Consortium News. So I gave him a few articles, and Bob passed away 3 years ago. And shortly after that, I became the editor of Consortium News. It's the first online alternative news magazine. What I talked about today, the origin of what I want to talk about, based on an article I published last month, was an interview, a conversation I had with Dan Ellsberg in his house in California, overlooking San Francisco Bay. And Dan mentioned that the US did not have an Official Secrets Act. We later had Dan on our webcast CM Live, and he went further and said because the US doesn't have an Official Secrets Act, and because the US has the First Amendment, Julian Assange as a journalist and publisher could not be indicted. And then Julian Assange was indicted. And I began thinking about whether the US, in fact, has an Official Secrets Act. How different is the Espionage Act from the Official Secrets Act? Well, I worked on this piece for about a year, and I did a history of the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act, comparing the evolution of both acts and the language in both of them. And I find that because Assange, a journalist, was in fact indicted by the Espionage Act, that there's not that much difference between the Official Secrets Act in Britain and the US Espionage Act. The language of both of these acts, while that might not have been the original intention, always allowed the indictment of a journalist for publishing defense information or state secrets. Of course, the Espionage Act at the beginning did indict a bunch of journalists, but only for opposing the draft, never for possession and dissemination of defense information. I think the aim of both are the same in allowing this to be the case. And Britain, of course, has, way before Julian Assange, there have been a couple of cases where the British government did indict journalists under their official secrets. One was in 1971. Reporters at the Sunday Telegraph were prosecuted under the 1911 Official Secrets Act for publishing Foreign Office documents about British policy in the Civil War. In Nigeria, the government lost that case trial as the material was shown to have been merely embarrassing to the government. And then 7 years later, 1978, two British journalists were indicted under the same 1911 Official Secrets Act in the so-called ABC trial. They published an article in the magazine Time Out about wiretapping by the GCHQ, the Signals Intelligence Agency of Britain. The Section 1 charges of that act were dropped by the judge for being oppressive in the circumstances. Two of the journalists, John Barry and Duncan Campbell, were convicted in Old Bailey, same room, courthouse where Assange had his extradition hearing, but they received minimal sentences. In the U.S., I'll go a little bit into the history now. Three presidents came close to indicting journalists and publishers for possession and dissemination of classified material. That's FDR, Nixon, and Obama. I will go into the details in a moment of those three cases. Of course, Donald Trump actually did it. He crossed that red line. And that is what, in my view, makes the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act very similar. The potential was always there, and while it had happened in Britain, never in the U.S., it has happened to a journalist who did not work in the U.S., and I'll get into that too. But the potential was always to the Espionage Act to indict a journalist for publishing classified information, and it really happened. The fact that that the U.S. does have a First Amendment, which Dan Ellsberg had pointed out was the reason why he didn't think Assange could be indicted, was indeed ignored in Assange's case, and that's what makes these two acts very similar. The threats to press freedom, of course, have been an integral part of the U.S. history, despite the First Amendment. There's been a long line of government repression of free speech in the U.S. It goes all the way back to British colonial American colonies in Britain. In the United States, the U.S. government then based their Espionage Act on the Official Secret. We go look at the essence of both of those acts. It deals with four main parts: the intent, whether a motive is relevant to the prosecution, whether a public interest defense is possible, the person who's liable for prosecution, whether only government officials, normally the source of leaked secrets, or anyone, including journalists who publish them, the issue of retention, whether mere unauthorized possession. The last is communication. As the laws, they have regarded unauthorized communication, defense information as being illegal. Julian Assange plays a huge role in the history of this matter of repression of free speech by governments. And again, it began in colonial America in the colony of New York. Bill Cosby, was the governor of New York, the British governor of New York. And Zenger, John Peter Zenger, of course, published an article accusing him of corruption. And in those days, under British rule in New York in 1735, truth was not a defense for libel. So it didn't matter if you published the truth. If you said something critical of a government official, that would be enough. But the jury in that case returned, even though the judge instructed them to find Zenger guilty, they found him innocent. A case of jury nullification. In other words, he broke the law, the existing law, but the jury found the law to be unjust, so they acquitted him. And that has been cited by signers of the Declaration of Independence as being the genesis of the First Amendment. Now, if Assange is ever extradited to the U.S., to the Eastern District of Virginia, and all of us here on this panel hope he isn't, then that Espionage Act conflict with the First Amendment could be challenged. After the revolution, the Sedition Act passed by John Adams, it made it illegal to write, print, or publish any false, scandalous, malicious writing against the government. Thomas Jefferson annulled that law and freed people who had been jailed, turned back their fines. The First Amendment during the Civil War and during subsequent wars, the issue of prior restraint, which is really censorship, has always been ignored, even though there's no legal justification, even during wartime, to censor the press. Abraham Lincoln was faced with a dilemma. He saw that many newspapers were shut down and editors thrown in jail in the North for opposing the draft or opposing the war. He said, must a government of necessity be too strong for liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? He actually reversed an order by a general to suspend the Chicago Times, and he criticized another general for arresting the editors of the Missouri Democrat. Now we come to 1889 when the Official Secrets Act was first enacted, the very first one. Now before that, there had been no espionage laws under the US or Britain. The only crime that anyone could be accused of in leaking a state secret was theft of government property. And then came along, in that context, the case of Charles Marvin, a very interesting story. He was a Foreign Office official, but he also freelanced articles on the side to make extra money. He memorized a secret treaty between Russia and Britain, and he went to the newspaper that he was writing for and produced this thing from memory. And they tried to prosecute him, but they couldn't because he hadn't actually removed the document from the Foreign Office. He hadn't stolen government. So some people believe it inspired the very first espionage law that went after a journalist, which in 1889, the Official Secrets Act, actually there's a clause in there that refers to, even if you memorize, it doesn't, these aren't exact words, but it does say that if you memorize a treaty to publish it, that's also legal. It's the catalyst for the to stop a journalist from obtaining publishing state secrets. This was the first law, the first espionage law, and it became the basis for all of the all the Official Secrets Acts in Britain and the Espionage Act and its various iterations and amendments in the United States. The 1889 Act, interestingly enough, the first one, had explicitly mentioned a public interest defense. Those words actually appear in the language of the 18th, but it was only for government employees. So in other words, as Jimmy was referring, when Petraeus leaked something, he wasn't punished. But so this 1889 Official Act actually gave a public interest defense to a government official only who would leak a state secret if it was in the public's interest, which I find quite interesting. The 1811 Official Secrets Act, that was removed. Public interest, the language was removed, although lawyers could still make that argument. The burden of proof shifted to defendants from prosecutors in that 1911 Official Secrets Act. They no longer had to prove the 1889 requirement that a defendant's motive was prejudicial to the state. In fact, that 1911 Act said you didn't have to prove that actually an offense was committed, but that the character of the person was in question. It's an extraordinary broad language of the 1911 Official Secrets Act. The U.S. Defense Secrets Act came just 6 months before that and was the very first U.S. espionage law that's very much based on the Official Secrets Act. Of course, it wasn't enough for Woodrow Wilson. In his 1915 State of the Union address, he called for what became the Espionage Act. And Wilson wanted formal censorship to be in the Espionage Act. He thought the government should have that power. Now, it was passed, of course, and right as the U.S. was entering the war against Germany in the First World War. But he didn't get his censorship amendment. It failed by one single vote in the Senate. And most of the press then there was a big outcry against it in the United States against formal censorship. But it allowed, again, the Espionage Act to be used to jail journalists and others for writing and speaking against the draft. While Wilson didn't get his Censorship Act, he did push through the 1918 Sedition Act, which is not an act on its own. It became part of the Espionage Act, even though it's referred to as an act. And this, it demanded loyalty to the flag and state worship. it really distills the essence of the kind of enforced loyalty of the population to the symbols and the military power of the state. And it really, in my view, demolishes the idea that the U.S. is exceptional. It shows the U.S. Is enforcing the same state worship as most nations in history. When we moved to the Second World War, there was, again, prior restraint, which was, though technically illegal, was pretty much accepted by every newspaper in the U.S. They agreed to self-censorship. And actually, Douglas MacArthur said that during the Korean War, that he wanted to continue this self-censorship and not impose formal censorship on the press. But in fact, when some American papers started writing about U.S. losses on the battlefield, that they did impose official and formal censorship on the U.S. press during the Korean War. In the Second World War, and I mentioned this at the beginning, FDR did actually impanel a grand jury in Chicago to go after editors and reporters at the Chicago Tribune, which had published an article that showed that in the Battle of Midway, the U.S. had broken the Japanese code. And the grand jury refused an indictment. Just a couple of years ago, there was an attempt to get that grand jury testimony, which was still secret, to become public. And the government today, I think this was 2 or 3 years ago, still refused to allow that grand jury testimony from the 1940s during this Midway battle and the Chicago Tribune case to become public. So we really don't know why the grand jury refused, but they did refuse to indict the Tribune. 5 years later, I have to mention the McCarran Internal Security Act. It made the most significant changes to the Espionage Act, and the most important was to remove intent and make mere retention of defense information illegal. Before, if someone possessed unauthorized possession of state secrets or defense information, the government had to demand it to be returned. If they didn't demand that, you could hold on to it, but that changed. You had to automatically return whatever you had if you didn't have authorization for it. This was one of the things about the Internal Security Act. While that act was being debated in Congress in 1949, a West Virginia senator named Harley Kilgore, he wrote to McCarran, Senator McCarran, whose name is on the act, and he warned him that the amendment, quote, might make practically every newspaper in the United States and all the publishers, editors, and reporters into criminals without their doing any wrongful act. Harry Truman actually vetoed this bill. He didn't make reference in his statement, his vetoing statement, to the changes to the Espionage Act, because there were other aspects of the Internal Security Act, but he did veto it, but it was overridden. And had it in the McCarthyist atmosphere that was building in Congress then in 1950, had it not been overridden and had Truman's veto been upheld, it may have been harder to indict Julian Assange. Now, why is Assange, who is based in Britain, published in Britain, these U.S. documents about the Afghan war and Guantanamo, how could he be charged under the U.S. law when he did not operate in the U.S. and he's not a U.S. citizen? Well, there was an amendment in 1961. There was a case in Warsaw of a U.S. Diplomat at the embassy there who was caught in bed with a woman who was not his wife, and officials, secret agent services burst into the room and took a photograph of him. They blackmailed him. They showed him the pictures. They wanted some documents from the embassy. Otherwise, they would put this in the newspaper. These pictures, this is the 1960s, early 60s, different mores then about adultery, of course, than we have today. So he did, in fact, remove documents from the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, which is U.S. territory, which would be covered by the Espionage Act, as it was put onto Polish territory, and gave the documents. He was found out and fired, but he could not be indicted under the Espionage Act because he'd left U.S. territory. He was incensed. A member of Congress who pushed through an amendment in 1961, which made it universal. So there's now universal jurisdiction of the Espionage Act. Anywhere in the world, anyone who breaks the Espionage Act can be indicted, and that's what happened to Julian Assange. I moved to the 1989 Official Secrets Act, which removed the intent essentially and the public interest defense almost completely. This was the case, of course, of Clive Ponting, a Ministry of Defense official who leaked some documents to a member of parliament that showed that the Thatcher government was lying when they said that the Belgrano, an Argentine ship, had been inside this exclusion zone around the Falklands during the Falklands War, when in fact it had already left the exclusion zone. So this was a great embarrassment to the Thatcher government. Tried to, and they did indict under the Official Secrets Act Clive Ponting, but he was, and the government, the judge told the jury, you must find him guilty because the public interest is what the government of the day says it is. That's a direct quote. But the jury acquitted him on the grounds that what he'd done was indeed in the public interest. Anyway, I'll wrap up by saying that until Assange's arrest, there had been perhaps a difference between the Espionage and Official Secrets Act, because the Official Secrets Act had been used to indict journalists in Britain, but never in the US. Now, Britain doesn't have a First Amendment, but the Official Secrets Act, the Official Secrets Act does not say anything about prior restraint. That's the other issue I want to bring up. In Britain, there have been cases of prior restraint, unlike the Pentagon Papers case, where it's a clear violation of the First Amendment. What we must understand about the Pentagon Papers case is that though the Supreme Court decided in favor of the New York Times that the government could not exercise prior restraint, they could exercise, and there were opinions of justices in that case, that after publication, the government can prosecute journalists for publishing. In fact, Richard Nixon impounded the grand jury in Boston to indict reporters at the New York Times for publishing the Pentagon Papers. And that grand jury only fell apart when Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office had been broken into, and the judge in his case was offered a bribe to become FBI director if he was able to get Ellsberg put. So Ellsberg's case collapsed. We also found out that Ellsberg's phone had been tapped. So the reporters said to the government, if you tapped Ellsberg, you probably tapped us. And that's when they dropped the grand. So Nixon tried to indict journalists. FDR tried to indict journalists. So did Obama, of course, tried to indict Julian Assange. Came up against the so-called New York Times problem. They felt that if they indicted Assange they'd have to indict the New York Times for the exact same documents that they both published in 2010. So the Obama administration stopped short. The Trump administration went forward. So I think that the fact is that the Official Secret and the Espionage Act are now very, very closely aligned. In fact, Judge Vanessa Baraitser, in her extradition decision on Assange, made it clear that what Assange is being accused of in the US has to also be against the law in Britain, and she cites the Official Secrets Act in making that argument. Ellsberg was incorrect. But that's a very wide opinion in the US. I came across an article by Tom Wicker in the New York Times during the Pentagon Papers case in which he quotes Dean Acheson, at that time a former Secretary of State, who called for a severe Official Secrets Act in the US to stop journalists getting documents from guys like Ellsberg. So this feeling and this idea that because Britain doesn't have a First Amendment, that the US Official Secrets Act somehow is not existent in the US, that the US has a more liberal law, is now, I think, been debunked because of Assange's arrest for publishing classified material, and that goes right up against the First Amendment. So I don't see much difference between the two. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. That was an absolutely fascinating account of the history of the official development of Official Secrets Act and the Espionage Act, and a very persuasive account of why there needs to be reform of the Official Secrets Act, the Espionage Act, and the public interest defense for whistleblowers and whistleblower journalists for any for freedom of the press, democracy, and so forth. Absolutely brilliant. Thanks a lot. We don't really have time for questions, I'm afraid, due to the depth and breadth of the presentations that have been given. All fascinating, absolutely fantastic. I'd like to say a few things just to wrap up. Firstly, thanks very much to the speakers. Their great integrity, their great courage, and their generosity of spirit in attending events like this, and educating the public, educating everybody about matters of great urgency facing our citizenry, wherever we may be. And and thanks. Just good luck with the continuing activism and continuing work in journalism, in activism, and law, and so forth. I think Nancy Hollander is presenting in the other room right now with Deepa, but otherwise, someone's asked me to offer. Yeah, and this will all be online later, shortly as well. So thanks a lot, everybody. I'm going to hang around in this room for a chat if anyone wants one. But otherwise, thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.